My name's Harriet Mansell. I'm the chef owner of Robin Wylde restaurant in Lyme Regis and also Lilac Restaurant and Wine Bar. Both restaurants specialise in local seasonal produce. We work very closely with the farms and the fishermen, etc. And buying and sourcing locally, we do a fair bit of foraging as well to make our menus nice and interesting. I believe that there's an increased interest in cider within the chefing community and I think, well, the broader community in general actually, because you have artisan cider makers actually pushing their respective fields. You know, they're trying to create more interesting ciders that are, you know, very much akin to wine in terms of, like, you know, the method that they're being created with. You know, it's the same method as with wine. So I think that as a chef, or I mean, I speak for myself when I say that I'm focused on flavour and doing a tasting menu, and with every single course there's a drink that is paired with the food. You don't stop at wine, you work with what's around you. And I mean, in this part of the world, the southwest of England, of course, we're well known for cider, but it's gone beyond the southwest of England. You know, lots and lots of places are interested in the increasing number of styles and varieties of cider that are out there now. And there's, well, it's not the case that there's something to please everyone, it's just the case that there are ciders that you would choose over wine to pair with food. A pairing is all about, you know, completing the food that's going in your mouth. You're eating something delicious and you want something that's going to bring it together or something that's going to oppose it. So it needs to either be complementary or in opposition to the food. And with the cider, you have that. I mean, lots and lots of ciders, you can have them chilled and sparkling, and of course you're going to get that similarity between, well, a traditional champagne method cider, you know, you're drawing the direct comparison to a champagne, and then other ciders that potentially don't have that, you know, they've got that more farmyard, that kind of more earthy background note to them, then, you know, that's equally good to pair with food because you're able to go in a different direction with it. I find that oftentimes when we're looking to create a pairing, for the more autumnal earthy dishes that we put on, we'll always end up moving towards skin contact wines or ciders because they have that, they often have that same feeling. But again, that's just a very specific type of cider. There are so many ciders. Some of the ciders that work very nicely with some of the ingredients on my particular menu, and I speak from the middle of the summer. We have a menu that's very light at the moment. It's actually very seafood focused, and you know, we're looking to either create harmony or create opposition with some of the fish dishes that we have. And at the moment we have a dish of mackerel and carrots. It's a very simple yet humble dish because of the ingredients. They're very cheap, inexpensive ingredients, but we're looking to really take those forward. So you've got an oily fish that is still so delicate. You know, you don't want to overpower that, you don't want to overwhelm it. The dish itself is actually quite a careful balance of acidity. It doesn't mean it's an acidic dish, it means that we're using acid as the component that is seasoning the ingredients. For instance, the carrots are smoky and they need a little bit of something to lift them in terms of sweetness, and that acidity is what kind of makes it dance on your tongue. And the mackerel, again, it's lifted with a pear vinegar from our local brewery. But again, that dish, it will benefit from being complemented by, I would choose Find and Foster, their traditional champagne method, method traditionnel. It's so clean and crisp, and if you can imagine, you know, an oily mackerel, and that is something that you want. It's not taking away from the flavours in the dish, because even though it is a careful balance of flavours, there's smokiness in there already, there's a bit of tang, there's a bit of acidity. You don't want a cider that's going to pull it in a direction where all you've got is this appleiness. You need something that's more pared back. And the light bubble that you'll get from Polly and Matt's cider is something that will work really harmoniously. It's really magical actually to have all those things coming together, and it's lifting it even more. The bubble is bringing the mackerel and the carrots to the forefront. So that's a dish that we would serve earlier on our menu, because it's a little bit more lively. As you progress through a menu, you tend to intensify the flavours, and you tend to work with perhaps ingredients that are slightly slightly more bold or challenging, but or not challenging, slightly denser ingredients. At the beginning of the menu, it's all very light, and again, that's why you would have that dish with that cider at the beginning, where you still want to dance around with all those flavours and play around with those ingredients and challenge and surprise people. We would use cider in the kitchen in a number of different ways, and it's very akin to how we would use wine in the kitchen, I would say. We don't like to see wine or cider go to waste if you've opened a bottle and it's gone flat or something like that, or actually it's become a little bit funky. What we would do with both of those products is we would then reduce them, and then we'll store them in little squeezy bottles or something like that as a seasoning. So rather than turning to citrus, which obviously doesn't grow here in the British Isles, we turn to reductions of alcohol, you're getting all that acidity from the cider or from the grape, and reducing it, and then that's your liquid seasoning to add to a dish, and it's got something different to it than every single type of, or every single form of acidity that we work with all brings something different. One thing that's right for something isn't right for another, and there aren't any rules. It's not like there are any hard, fast rules to that. It's just that the flavour of that particular reduction of cider, and that that's probably going to complement whatever vegetable or protein that you're working with. So it does actually become more of a feeling in terms of how you're using something. I don't think we need to overcomplicate this, because it does sound a little bit technical when you say, I'm reducing these wines for this purpose and this cider for this purpose. But no, we just reduce them down, we preserve them in that way, and then they'll be used in a vinaigrette, perhaps. They'll get used in a marinade. It forces you to work a little bit more intuitively when you're looking to reduce your wastage, if that's your driving force, which actually we are always looking to reduce our wastage and to create new flavours and work creatively. So any ingredient that we've got, we'll try and process it. And again, that's why we reduce leftover alcohols down in that way. So that's practically speaking how we tend to use a lot of cider. Obviously, if we're looking to slow cook a meat, braise a piece of meat, whether it's pork belly or something else, or a shoulder of lamb or something like that, if you're going to be doing that with some cider or perry, you're pulling that into the meat, and that's going to complement it. I mean, lots of people, they cook gammons with Coca-Cola, don't they? Yeah. And it's the same thing. If you're adding a sugary acidic liquid into your braising liquor, then you're going to be putting all of that into the end sauce, that end gravy that's going to go with your food, and that's going to be tasty. There is a difference between traditional farmhouse cider and the fine ciders that perhaps we're more invested in talking about. I mean, in the same way that the natural wine world has taken off, and there are lots of younger, trendier winemakers out there making more experimental drinks, some phenomenal, some less so. It's always going to be a mixed bag, and that's the same within any industry, isn't it? But if you're looking for flavour and quality of whatever that ingredient is, then that's what you're trying to navigate and find. Traditional farmhouse cider, the scrumpies, etc., they'll always have their place, and there's the people who of course love those things, and they want flat cider, they want it made that way. But also in the realm of the traditional farmhouse cider, you do have your pet nats, and that is how cider was originally made, and that's now become, actually it crosses over, doesn't it? It's in the fine cider side of things, because a pet nat is when the primary fermentation finishes within the bottle and you end up with the natural sparkle. But that is how cider was traditionally made, and that is how a lot of traditional cider makers still make it. They'll take their fermenting liquid, they'll bottle it, it will become sparkling because of the fermentation that has created that carbon dioxide in that bottle. And because with pet nats or your ancestral method, you've got a spontaneous fermentation that's occurred. Spontaneous fermentation is, I'm not a cider maker. I've learned a lot about fermentation, and as a chef we harness fermentation a lot in the kitchen, so I can say from experience it doesn't go to plan. And traditional ciders, they are based on an apple juice that has spontaneously fermented, and that process has kicked off. And sometimes you'll get those farmyard flavours, those funky things, and actually some people, they'll seek out those flavours. That's what they're looking for. They're looking for something different. And it's the same in the world of winemaking. Those funky, chewy, booty flavours, they were considered a fault. But now sometimes people are harnessing them because they understand the bacterial strains. They know that if they use a certain bacterial strain, or if they can see something happening that's souring their drink, then actually that is something that can be pulled into the world of, something delicious, that is something that is going to work with food. So I think that is, again, something even different to fine cider, because when I think of fine cider, we're talking about much more like the traditional champagne method, people who are like putting their cider through that second fermentation to create that fine bubble, to create that much more delicate finish that perhaps you didn't really, or perhaps if you haven't had it before, you wouldn't associate it with cider. But then there's all those offshoot, funky, acidic things that other people are enjoying as well. And chefs in particular, I think, when they're looking for something to pair with their food, or sommeliers when they're looking to pair something with food and they want it to be different or challenging, or they want to get something that doesn't exist within the world of wine, that's when that suddenly comes in at the fine dining side of things, because you're having food that's then paired with a cider that you wouldn't necessarily recognise as a cider. I've taken a bit of a ramble there, so back to the original question: is there a place for farmhouse ciders? God, of course there is. There's a place for all of it. When cider perhaps first came on my radar as a chef, I probably would just go back probably just a few years, because I worked for a brewery called 𝗕𝗿𝗶𝗴𝗏, and they used to work with a lot of, they used to create a lot of different flavour and different style beers, and that actually opened my world up in terms of the beer side of things. But then cider went hand in hand, and I remember noticing for the first time that a lot of ciders that had undergone perhaps a spontaneous fermentation, they tasted cidery, and it was that realisation that it wasn't it wasn't apple. I mean, you've got something that's got malt and hops in it, but then what was it that made it taste cidery? And it was that first moment of realising, oh, that's the natural yeast that exists, and that's the direction that it's taking that liquid in. And again, you get that in the world of winemaking as well. A lot of the time you'll have something and you'll say, oh, that tastes cidery, because that's your connection. And I think I realised back then that I became aware that there were cider makers who were doing something a little bit more interesting. But then I think the first time that I really realised that cider could be something different was meeting Polly and Matt from Find & Foster, and understanding that they're making this fantastic end product, this champagne method cider that knocks a lot of other ciders out of the water. It's absolutely phenomenal, and we've served it to customers over the past couple of years, and it never fails to surprise people, because we'll serve that as our aperitif at the beginning of our meal, or like I say, perhaps with the mackerel and carrots. It's that early thing to just say to people, this is a champagne method cider. It blows people's minds still, and seeing their approach, which is different, I think, still to some other cider makers, because they don't make cider by variety of apple. They make it by the flavour. And if you're lucky enough to spend some time with Polly, a force to be reckoned with in terms of her knowledge and her approach to her cider making, her and Matt's cider making, she doesn't say, oh, I'm going to pick this Kingston Black apple. She says, I'm going to taste this apple, because they find so many orchards from around Devon, and they look after them, and that's the reason why they're called Find & Foster. they look after the orchards in exchange for the apples. So I've walked around these orchards with Polly, and she said to me before, I'm not sure what this variety is, nobody knows, because, what was it she said to me? One thing that was interesting, and I didn't know this, perhaps you already do know this, but when an apple pip falls into the ground, or you have like a Bramley apple, and the Bramley apple's pip falls into the ground and it grows into a tree, it doesn't become a Bramley apple tree, it becomes an apple tree, a kind of hybrid apple tree, and that's how it evolves. Kind of like humans, but it's not right, you know, to create another Bramley apple tree, you'd have to do some grafting, and that's what obviously lots of people, they do. But in the orchards that Polly uses, it's a variety of ancient strains of apple variety, and she tastes them, and when she tastes every single apple, and I'm sure she's going to ruin her teeth one day, but she tests it for tannins, she tests it for sugar, for sweetness, she tests it for acidity, and she'll know when she's tasted that apple what it's got, and she'll in her mind be then blending that and figuring out what she's going to do. So she knows, oh, we'll take these apples and those will go into that blend. That blend needs some more acidity, so we're going to take all the really acidic apples. And when she gave me an apple that was so high in tannin, she said, oh, you're not going to believe this, because I'd never done it before. I ate it and I was like, oh my God, it just takes over your mouth and you're like, this is not enjoyable. But that is needed to provide body and structure within some of her blends, and she'll only use a certain quantity, or she'll use the right quantity. So she's a mastermind, bringing that all together and predicting what's going to happen throughout that fermentation, and predicting what's going to happen to the end product. And she's constantly experimenting and working with those varieties, which I just think is so interesting, because she's approaching it in the way that a chef would approach the food. She's tasting the apples to determine their qualities. And it's the same thing we do in the kitchen. We taste everything. We taste every herb that comes through the door, because herbs, even from the same farm, they taste different week on week, depending on the weather and the conditions that week. So everything that you have in the kitchen tastes different all of the time. And that's then more interesting from a chef perspective, because you know that every blend that they've made is probably going to taste different, and you don't know what it's going to go with. And like even with your taste buds, they're going to be changing. Some advice regarding tannins within ingredients in terms of winemaking and cider. That you detect the tannin when you take a sip of the cider or the wine, or a sip of black tea. If you take a sip of something that you know has tannins in, like those 3 ingredients, it's that thing that kind of clouds up your mouth, it dries it really dries it up, you feel that. And that's why, you know, with a big red wine, for instance, you'll need to be pairing that with food, because you won't just want to have a sip of it. It will dry your mouth up, it will be unpleasant, but that body that wine has, it really holds up to something big and ballsy on the food front. So it really has its place, you know. So that's the same within cider, and then if you were to, I mean, once you start to be able to detect tannins in something, in the same way that you detect sweetness and acidity or saltiness, it's just another part of something. You'll pick up on it, and you would then realise, oh, I probably want to be pairing that with some food that's got a little bit more going on, like I said earlier, with the sparkling, the light sparkling traditional champagne method, that goes very nicely with the slightly oily seafood. But perhaps if you had a bigger, more tannic cider, you'd be looking to have that a little bit further on in the development of your menu or your meal. So it's just I don't think there's any need to get bogged down in that. It's just understanding that is a part of the mouthfeel of what you're drinking or eating, and understanding if you wanted to start to break down why something went with something else. I mean, there is a science to all of these things. I am more of a creative person, and I don't like to get involved in the science too much, because it's not my forte, but actually I probably do understand a lot of it because of the nature of the ingredients and understanding fermentation. it's just something to be aware of as an ingredient. I think the way that cider is going to develop over the next 5 to 10 years within British chef or dining culture is that, yes, of course we'll see more of it, because there are more people making exciting drinks and exciting labels, and labels catch people's eyes. And, you know, how else do you judge a book? I'm going to buy its front cover. You know, these all look lovely, don't they? So I think the more that people see on the shelves and the more that people choose to stock them as ingredients, and I think we have about 12 ciders on our list here, the more that it's an option for people then to come and try them, then of course it raises people's awareness of them. We use cider on our drinks pairing, not every drinks pairing, but where it's appropriate as a drink. We like to use what's correct or what we think works with the food. So if there are more ciders to choose from, of course, it's probably more likely that they'll appear on the menu. And then when more people are using ciders, more chefs are looking, you know, on Instagram and they're seeing them being used, probably it's then inspiration to then go and try them, because more in existence. I think, of course, there are going to be there's going to be much more going on. I used cider on the Great British Menu when I entered it a couple of years ago, and I used it as my starter. I actually used 𝗶𝗶𝗲𝗏 and cider, and I don't know how many other people were choosing to use it, but for me, I was told with the brief that year, you had to very rigidly represent your local area, and so it made perfect sense to me to create a dish based on apples and therefore pair it with cider. And the flavour was there, but no, it's a dish I had on the menu at various points as well. And yeah, I think more and more chefs will continue to use them, particularly in fine dining restaurants where there's a drinks pairing, and particularly where chefs and sommeliers are in agreement that it's a drinks pairing, not a wine pairing, because that then becomes a bit more interesting. I remember when I went to eat it was probably the first time that I considered a drinks pairing, not a wine pairing, was when I went to eat at Osteria Francescana in Modena in Italy. Massimo Bottura's very famous restaurant out there, and I think the fourth drink or something that I had on the pairing was a cocktail with all these aromatics in it, and it was so different to have that. And I'm pretty sure there was a cider on there as well. I mean, this was about 4 years ago now, so I remember just going, yeah, no, this is exciting. It doesn't have to be wine. It doesn't have to be that one fruit type that we know. There are other fruit types, and as long as there are other people willing to work closely with those ingredients and work on quality and finesse and then marketing that as a thing that's different to what people knew of that thing, e.g. scrumpy, then you know, you've got a product that is going to move into a higher kind of position in terms of how it's perceived. We have quite a unique situation in terms of our food and drink offering here at Robin Wylde and Lilac, because we have, well, complete and utter control. I do the wine pairing, I do the drinks pairing, I do the food. It's something that I don't have to argue with anybody about. In terms of the fact the whole team comes together and tastes everything and says, oh yeah, I think that goes, or perhaps I think that doesn't go, more often than not, we're all in agreement about things. Yeah, my friend Chris Onions, he's a chef, and he uses cider in the same way that I do. You know, I think he views it's a drink to accompany food, so pick the most appropriate drink that's going to make the food sing or make the drink. They're both equally important. So yeah, you're just looking for quality really, and if the quality's there and it matches, then that's what you're going to use. I don't know, I haven't had conversations with sommeliers about their thoughts and feelings on the use of cider versus wine, so I imagine it's changing with this increased range of options available.